Hi, my name's Terry, and in my video I will be talking about traditional Mexican clothing. Hope you enjoy! In major cities, modern Mexican clothing does not differ very much from the clothes we use every day. In fact, many young Mexican people living in the big cities tend to wear clothes like loud-colored cotton t-shirts, sneakers, and jeans. But this changes a lot when we get out of the main cities and look into the smaller towns, where we can see modern clothes blended with a more native, a more Mexican feel. Traditional Mexican clothing combines native and European elements. The fibers of choice among the Mexicans are cotton, bark, and agave, which were known and used by native Mexican pre-Hispanic civilizations to make their clothes, as well as wool and silk, introduced by the Spanish later. In the past, Mexican clothing was dyed with natural components found in local plants, but as soon as aniline dyes were brought from Europe, they became the first dyeing choice. Typical women clothing includes skirts and other garments. We can find traditional Mexican clothing in many varieties, and it can be distinguished by gender, by social status, and by ethnic group. For instance, garments worn by women differ from those worn by men. Native clothing is different to mestizo clothing. Mexican clothing for men is mostly European-like, which means that both the trousers and the shirt are European garments, and possibly the only native addition to the men's wardrobe is a large blanket cape called serape. Men often wear Mexican boots too. As for Mexican clothing used on celebrations, we can find a different costume for almost every special day of the year. National festivities are celebrated with typical clothes and accessories, including the famous Mexican sombrero. Some special days, like the Day of the Death, are closely related to religion, and that can be seen on the costumes too. During the carnival, Mexican clothing of choice is the charro suit, popularized by the famous musical ensembles known as the mariachis. In terms of tradition, Mexican clothing worn by Mexican men would be cotton shirts and trousers, with leather sandals called huaraches and wide-brimmed felt or straw hats known as sombreros. Traditional Mexican women typically wore long full skirts with a blouse and plastic sandals, and covered their heads with fringed shawls called rebozos. One example of traditional Mexican clothing is called the huipil. The huipil is a beautiful garment worn by women. It can be described as a sleeveless tunic or can be roughly said to be like a sack-like garment. Generally, cotton is used for huipil, but at times one can even see the use of wool. Here, rectangular strips of cloth are cut in varied lengths, either long or short, and this can be either wide or narrow in width. The fabric is woven and embellished with motifs that tell a story of old folklore. Another example of traditional Mexican clothing would be called quejimito, which is basically a cape where the head has to pass through the center of the opening, and the corners of the fabric are left hanging on four sides. To get a basic idea of the quejimito, you can rummage through your wardrobe and take a look at your very stylish poncho. The poncho is a ubiquitous garment that has made a comeback in the fashion scene. Generally, one can find the use of hand-woven cloth in the creation of quejimito. Another example of traditional Mexican clothing would be the rebozo. The rebozo is worn by women in Mexico. The origins of this piece of clothing cannot be placed correctly. That the rebozo originated due to the intermingling cultures that were colonized by Spain. The rebozo is rectangular in shape and is found in materials like cotton, silk, wool, or even articella. The rebozo is also worn as a shawl or a scarf. Sometimes women also use a rebozo to carry goods to the market. Mexican women also wear pueblas. Puebla dresses and bosses generally have short sleeves and loose fits. The Mexican folklore dresses are used by traditional folk dancers and are very fancy in their overall look. The design of the upper half closely resembles the Puebla blouse. The design of the lower half is also fancy and in many tiers. Perhaps the most basic item of traditional Mexican wear is the skirt. The skirt is unique for its embroidery. The embroidery used forms an integral part of the clothing. Most outfits are beautifully styled with colorful embroidery done on. These embroideries are also known to use symbols that have a specific meaning behind them. Skirts are the most well-known part of Mexican clothing. And lastly, we have the iconic sombrero, or sombra. The Mexican sombrero forms an integral part of Mexican clothing. This term simply refers to a kind of hat that has a brim. The brim acts as a way of protection from the sun. Such sombreros are generally worn as a part of traditional clothing. The peasant sombreros are generally made out of straw, whereas some are made out of pelt, which inclines towards the expensive side.